by something, but it's not like airplane, like it's just in my page. And so it's not tight to the ceiling, so we're gonna see how aesthetically that suits me. Okay, so stop the unique love that I would I have to say though, they steal my ideas all the time. Like, oh, let's do this. And I'm like, I thought of it first. But anyway, it's like, okay. All right, we're back. So I could just, battle forever. We rearranged the seating for the audience behind me so that they can see you guys more, because quite honestly, I think they're more interested in what you have to say than what I have to say. Entertainment, much as I might be. So let's talk about Dropboxes. A couple of things that some of these things we've talked about in the past, and we've discussed in the work groups, and I think the first one is one that I think we were pretty much in accord on, and that is mandatory versus optional, and that it should be left to the counties if they feel that is a need that would be appropriate for their county, that we would not require, we would not recommend requiring every county to provide them because they may not be appropriate for that county. So let's talk about whether we are in fact on board with that. One part of that was also to the extent you have them, are we going to recommend any minimum number of boxes or anything like that? So anybody want to talk about that?
If I may, thank you. This has been an issue. It's been a concern of mine, and it's interesting. In Lawrence County, we've taken a couple of approaches based on the votes of the three of us serving as the Board of Elections. Back in the 2020 election, we voted up by a 2-to-1 vote to have a drop box at the entrance to the courthouse, the internal entrance. And then we put at three different magisterial judge offices. I was the opposing vote. And then last year, we scaled that back. It was again a 2-to-1 vote. My one fellow commissioner took a different approach from the prior year. And we only had the one drop box once again at the entrance to the courthouse. And I've given this a lot of thought. And the concern I have is finding a way in which you can have drop boxes and have a level playing field in terms of accessibility to those drop boxes. If you have, in our case, let's say, in the case of Lawrence County, we have 16 townships and 10 boroughs and 1 third-class city. And if we put drop boxes in, let's say, 5 of the 16 townships, to me, you're giving the voters in those 5 townships an advantage, and you're placing the ones in the remaining townships at a disadvantage in terms of accessibility, in terms of convenience. I think in an ideal world, you'd have one at least in every, not precinct, but at least in every municipality, or let's say in the case of the city of Philadelphia, one in each ward. Now, that's cumbersome and probably not practical. But the concern I have with Dropbox is notwithstanding the fact, as you know, they're not mentioned in the law. That word apparently is not mentioned in any of the statutes. But my concern is fairness to the voters in terms of their ability to access them. Unless you have them almost everywhere, you are now creating an unlevel playing field, I would offer, for voters. But that all being said, I would concur with the thought process of allowing it to be optional county. Thank you for letting me offer my input.
But I think if you allow it to be optional county by county, then you run into one county has and another county does not. So I don't think optional would go. And in Montgomery County, we have 62 municipalities. I will not support 62 drop boxes. We do 14 there, and pretty much everyone is within 20 minutes of a drop box. I mean, we're a large county. You know, it just kind of shocks me how drop boxes have become such a thing, and people become so obsessed with the drop boxes. In the primary election, of the 64,000 mail-in ballots we had for the election, about 15,000 of them were returned to drop boxes. Some people definitely prefer the drop boxes, because we mentioned a few times during the course of this meeting is that people don't trust the postal service. So what people like about the drop boxes is that they know that they're dropping it takes out a step, and that the county is going to get them. But I think there definitely should be some uniformity around whether they're banned or not, or whether there's video surveillance and those types of things. Because I think if we do it county by county, that creates an unlevel playing field as well. But different counties certainly will have different needs for maybe the number of drop boxes that they need.
If I may, you said there were two options for the legislation on drop box. What were those two options again? There's a third option, which is prohibited.
No.
And I just want to put that out there.
You're right.
And the reason I put that out there is because I think that a lot of the consternation over drop boxes themselves, just the idea itself, is that a lot of Pennsylvanians consider a polling place kind of a protected bubble. When you go in, you do your civic duty, your secrecy and there are people there who are officiating and making sure all the rules are followed. And the drop boxes take voting outside of that. And I understand that just voting by mail does that to a certain extent as well. So I think that the angst over drop boxes is because we've now gone outside that protected bubble, where we're sure that all the regulations are being followed and everybody's doing it the same way, and we are in fact getting away from uniformity. And I don't care. It's not necessarily that the 5 townships have an advantage over the other 10, because you could locate them adjacent to another township and then everybody in 2 townships. Anytime you allow something like this to be an option, and even if you put some sort of, okay, we need one for every 10,000 voters or whatever number you put, in some way, there's going to be one voter who's more disadvantaged than another voter, no matter how you slice it. And when you talk about elections that cross county lines, if all your elections are within your county, I think the counties could do this easy. But when you have elections that cross county lines, as we saw in that one set of elections, it was both in Allegheny County and Westmoreland County, whenever 2 counties are doing something different, now voters in that one electoral district, be it a Senate district, congressional district, what have you, different voters in certain areas of that district are going to be disadvantaged in one way, and other voters are going to be advantaged. So, in the broad sense of this, unless we can find a way, ironclad way, to make sure that every voter is treated absolutely equally, I'm not sure they're a good idea, because quite frankly, a drop box doesn't really help the voter who doesn't have. And it's already equal with mail-in voting because everyone has a mailbox right outside their house. I get that the mail is a whole entity that we don't control in the state. So that's why I wanted to say there was a third option for the General Assembly. And I know there are a number of legislators who would support a prohibition of that.
Yeah, you're right. If I jumped past that step of whether they were needed at all.
Right.
So thank you for bringing that up.
If we're talking about equality and making sure that the voting experience is the same for each voter across the state, why wouldn't we have one uniform piece of equipment across the state? We've already disregarded that. We have 67 counties that have 67 different elections. And I think that to state that we're trying to legislate something that has to be under some guise of equality for this, but not equality for that, doesn't really fit the gist of what we're trying to do. So
That's a valid point. It's a fair point to make. It's a fair point to make. But when even, in that instance, when you have a congressional district that crosses those county lines and they're using two different systems, are those voters truly equal? And do federal regulations that are imposed through the state upon the counties further interfere with that ability for us across Pennsylvania to create actual equality? I mean, because even as it sits, if we just took mail-in voting out of it, precincts are different sizes. Right? Everybody has to travel a different distance to get to their voting precinct. Some townships only have one, they're huge townships. Then there's another township who has to share with another. So, I mean, there's levels of equality and then there's levels of.
right, we also have staffing. If we have one precinct that is fully staffed and another precinct that's understaffed, the voting experience for that voter is going to be different in each one. So I think that equality there, like maybe uniform guidelines are great, but to assume equality, it doesn't seem that we have a playing field that asks for that in precincts. So therefore we shouldn't be asking for that on mailing on. We're going with a number of different systems across the state. So we're going to have a number of different solutions based on population and based on land mass across the state as well. Just from a standpoint of how mail-in ballots are going to live in how the drop box issues.
So I guess going back to, stating the obvious, but it's called mail-in ballot. It's not called a drop-off ballot. And if the intent of the legislation was to have it be dropped off, then why didn't we have a drop-off ballot? I'm not trying to be smart, but we're talking about uniformity and security, which I completely agree there needs to be some uniformity. But just because it's talking about security doesn't mean it's going to be a secure vote. I mean, there is no way, to the chairman's point, whether it's through video or personnel. I mean, personnel is really the only way that you can make that vote secure. Video of somebody ransacking that, dropping a Molotov cocktail in that ballot box is not making that secure. You can go prosecute the person afterwards, but those votes that have been in there, first of all, you don't know who was in there, whose vote was in there, how many were in there. At that point, you've got a real problem. And that's why I've said, I'm not going to say never, because never is a long time, as I learned at a young age, but there's no way I can support putting a drop box in my county. It's going to be handed to my staff or it's going to be mailed in.
I've got one other concern as it relates to drop boxes and their physical location. And this might be an extreme example, but what's to preclude, let's say you have a 3-member board of commissioners who serve as the board of elections, 2 of whom are of one party. Those 2 decide we're going to put out 10 drop boxes. If they choose, put them in locations in which their party is the predominant party, and they overlook or don't put drop boxes in the communities in which the other party has the majority. Can that be stopped? Does that once again create an unlevel playing field? I don't know how you keep that from happening in a very political sense. It concerns me.
I would be interested in hearing from some of the commissioners about what security steps your counties take to secure the drop boxes that are for that. So, Mr. Chairman, you had mentioned, having someone man the box, security cameras, their procedures.
In 2020, we had them manned. In 2021 and in the primary of this year, we did not have them manned, but they were all under video surveillance. And then we'll be having a discussion about the general 22, but I would think it's going to go back to NAND just to address some of the things that, and it's an issue because then we have to get coverage for that. And we don't have people who are just waiting around to go. But so we've done it both ways. And I know in our surrounding counties too, they've done it both ways. But we've always had them, and even when they were manned, they were under video surveillance as well. So you have the added protection.
Is sheriff's department who manages them? Who manages them?
No, we use county employees, for private security. We use our sheriff's deputies to actually pick up the ballots each day.
As I noted, ours were located in 3 different magisterial district judges' offices, which have, as noted by the chairman, have video surveillance. And of course, the one at the entrance to the courthouse is right next to, as you come into the building, where you have to go through the security screening, and there's always a couple of sheriff's deputies there. So there was, you did have those protections built in.
Well, Commissioner Daly.
Yeah, so the broad sense of this, to your point, is that we are offering, because we are a state that is now transitioning to mail-in voting, we are offering the voters just additional opportunity to get out their ballot. It's no different putting your ballot in a mailbox or putting it in a drop box. So all your points that you were concerned with, like a Molotov cocktail, or who's touching it, or who's seeing who's putting what in the mailbox. If I'm putting in a United, for all those points, if I'm using a United States postal box or a drop box, all your same concerns are still, they're still the same, because you have no idea who's putting it in a United States postal box any more than you have any idea who's putting it in a mailbox, a drop box. If you want to be a state that is voting by mail and giving voters an opportunity to really partake in that, you provide mail drop boxes. We're not inventing the wheel here. There are all, if you go around the country and you go to other places, I was just in Seattle, there's drop boxes all over that are there all the time, and around election time, even in New Jersey. If you go to New Jersey, sure, you see drop boxes for mail ballots. They're pretty commonplace. It is just offering people another option for getting their ballot back to us. They don't have to do it. They can use the United States Postal Service, or they can vote in person, or they can bring it to the county office. It's just offering voters another option to get us back their ballot. We use them in Philadelphia. They're under 24-hour video surveillance. And you know, ideally, I would love to do more, because I would like to see them more, you know, in every nook and cranny of the city, or by the words you're doing. But you know, it's all money and staffing and infrastructure for cameras. But I believe that if we're going to do this, and people do have an option, and I don't really think it's, if people don't trust it, they're not going to vote by mail anyway. They're voting in person, or they're bringing us their ballot. So I would say that I don't think it's a bigger problem of people not trusting it, just based on the amount of people that use it. I think people feel safe. They trust the drop box because they know that nobody else is touching that mail. There's no postal service. It's not getting locked up at a post, at a central postal location. It's being dropped in that box and it's coming right back to the Board of Elections. There's no middle person. So from my point, I believe that if counties want to have them or they don't want to have them, or how many they have, certainly could be optional. But if you're gonna be a state that's going to transition into the future and be a mail ballot, and a state that's offering voters the opportunity to vote by mail, then this is just one more added service. It's not the only way to get us the ballot. So if you don't like it or you don't trust it, you can use the United States Postal Service, so you can hand deliver the ballot. But clearly, by the numbers that we saw of people that use them, people that are voting by mail do like the opportunity to use these drop boxes. They feel as though they're a safe and secure, more direct way of getting their ballot back to them.
Does anyone watch those video feeds
Or are they recorded? I mean, obviously, if someone ran up to one of these drop boxes and hit it with a Molotov cocktail, everyone's gonna want to see that footage. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out, because my county doesn't, we have one drop box in front of the courthouse, inside the courthouse building. Is there any review of these video camera feeds? Are they recorded and absent? Excuse me, I'm sorry.
It's the video footage.
It's okay, it's retained. Does anyone watch it unless if there's not an incident? And I'm asking, I'm not trying to make a point. I'm
And
trying
we
to
get right to know requests
Okay.
for it, and then people will go back. We have watchers at the drop boxes, so if they see something, then it comes back, but it's not a live, someone's not watching it.
And there is no.
We have live attendance at the box.
No, we don't, not in the past 2 elections.
And if there isn't a problem, none of your staff, and I think I know the answer, so I want to make sure. No one's reviewing this footage just for the heck. Like, you don't have someone who's like, oh, we have to watch this footage to make sure nothing. Thank you.
With regard to the fairness issue, I mean, there are other states that have statute that puts some criteria in place that they have to be, geographically distributed, other considerations that the local election officials have to be not just mindful of, but they have to follow. I mean, and that's something that we can consider, not to mandate a certain number, of course, and those states that do have. You got one drop box or one ballot returns for 20,000 voters. Those are only universal vote by now states, which we're not. But if they're, we could consider statute where if a county is going to have multiple return sites, that they do have to be distributing some sort of way. Because I mean, also like Lord knows that if a given county was going to deliberately put their locations in a discriminatory way in any particular format, that would probably be litigated. I imagine that there's such a probably good chance of winning, but. We can get in front of that with some sort of language, something that other states, it's just in terms of the fairness issue. And I think when I recall this coming up before, there didn't seem to be, any consensus or interest building around, again, mandating a certain number, just because every county is different. In Philly, a ton of folks vote by mail. I think these things are pretty important, especially in the last 5-6 days. Then other counties are small and people vote by them. So maybe one is feasible. I guess one little following question I'll add to that. Even for a county that doesn't have a quote unquote, drop box, some sort of receptacle inside or outside, I mean, any voter still can go to the elections office, right? Hand it over within regular working hours, up until election day, right? So,
And we've had no problems with that system.
yeah. So I mean, so all 67 counties have at least that drop off option up until election day, up until whenever.
And I would add, that's a good point. I think this is what to do with it. We had no issues with the undated or unsigned ballot because we're checking them every time we ask the question, is this your ballot? Okay, so you got what you need. Thank you very much. It's filed. So, last election, when everybody said, when the Department of State said, make sure you segregate all the undated ballots, we didn't have it. Because we're checking every one as it comes in. And we're making sure. We have to fix it if it's not there.
I think to Joe's point, we have used the drop off, we used one at our election office. And that was one of the questions asked, to make sure, again, that with me dropping off my ballot, I couldn't take my wife's along and so on. And again, same with the statute, the fact that these drop boxes or whatever you want to call them, I think they were referred to as different things in different states and the material, of course. Is there anything the legislation really mentions? I'm somewhat troubled by that. It's like we've extended things that we really drive the authority to.
I mean, to Lisa's point, why would we as a county take on the liability of adding the potential for the risk involved in having a drop box that's manned or not manned or wherever it may be? You're assuming risk when you put that out there to some degree. You're adding liability to your county if you're putting that drop box out there. There's an expectation that voter's ballot is going to be secure and counted securely when it's time to count the ballots. And again, no disrespect to the county commissioners that have chosen to use it. That's your choice. I completely get that. I can't take on that liability.
At the risk of saying something wrong, and put it in the US post office box, you're making that same assumption.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, but that's the vote, again, back to Russ's point, you're kind of giving up your right, you're giving up your risk that it may or may not get back here.
However, if you're a bad guy and you use the mail, now you're in real trouble.
Yeah, that's right.
But if you're a bad guy using Dropbox, that federal law enforcement threat does not exist. Yes.
What about a voter? I'm trying to think about, when I think about who the Dropbox helps. We live in the world where people are working multiple jobs. And they don't have the same amount of free time that maybe they did years ago, when everybody leave on Tuesday and they left on Sunday to go to polls back in 1937. So for example, in your county, if someone works at odd hours and they need to, they want to vote by mail because they can't take off work on election day, and they get their ballot, maybe they get their ballot 6 days before election day, because that's when the post office ordered it. Maybe they ordered it 50 days before, but they didn't get it until right before the election. The only way that they can drop that ballot off is from what, like 8 to 4 at your office.
We extend the hours a little bit during
Are-
that season.
Are there any options for someone that say works night work? Like what, like aside from dropping it in the US Postal Service, which at that point would not be, like it most likely would get it.
Right.
So do you feel that there's a need to have, like, that they're just, that's it, they can't? So, what is the thought for that? That's,
Again, being a responsible voter and make sure you're planning ahead to vote.
so if they're planning.
We're trying to take all the onus off the voter all the time. There's always a responsibility for the voter to get registered, to look, whether they choose to look at who's on the ballot or not, whether they choose to look at the deadlines or not. I mean,
Well, let's
just
assume.
having the mail-in ballot alone is giving them a greater option and greater availability to get that ballot.
But oftentimes the mail-in ballot, like if the voter is on the permanent list and they're like, hey, I work weird shift work, I'm a nurse, I'm working 12-hour days, I'm never going to be able to make it to the polling location to vote, so I'm going to request my mail-in ballot. In a perfect world, that mail-in ballot would get to them, 45 days before then. But say there's an error with the, we know this is we've seen a lot of errors with printing companies, with third-party printing companies that are printing mail-in ballots where something happens and this batch is no good, so another batch has to be run. If a voter is part of that group and they are not getting their ballot until the very last minute, that's not their fault. They might have done all of the steps that they needed. What are their, would you, if you were a county commissioner, then would you then extend the hours for people to drop off? Would you say, oh, hey, like, do you send a sheriff out to pick up their ballot? Like, I'm just thinking about how this, like, the convenience of a Dropbox is there for a reason, and
But it's not mandatory,
it is not.
and it's not clearly defined in the law. So why would I go to the extent of doing something that's not spelled out in the law?
You can say you have different hours too, you're all.
We do, yeah, we extend our, like, my election staff is there longer in the day when it's the last available week to drop off your ballot. And quite frankly, I mean, we've had circumstances where somebody will call and say, I can't get there until 6 o'clock. I mean, we'll do everything we can to accommodate that voter within reason, obviously. So, I mean, my staff comes over backwards to help every voter they can.
And to follow up on something Lisa was talking about, I think Lisa was analyzing drop boxes from the perspective of people who choose to use them, and how they're convenient for those people. God bless those folks. I think the concerns about drop boxes and something we should consider and bring into our thought process is the anxiety of those who don't use drop boxes and say, well, what's the security? How are you watching that? You have to remember these elections, although technically Philadelphia runs a pretty separate election from what Indiana County runs. I mean, amongst we election lawyers, we joke about how there's not one election on election day. There's 67 elections on election day because every county under statutory law has their board of elections has the right to do certain things different. In order to have that confidence that people in the western part of the state feel comfortable what's going on in the east and the east of the west, what I would like to see done with drop boxes is make sure that if a county chooses to use them, I think individual counties are different. Some really like drop boxes. I have no problem with them being used. I just want to be able to tell people in my county who don't like drop boxes and don't understand why they're being used. Yeah, they're using them out there, but these are the things they're doing to make sure they're safe, and we can all feel comfortable what those things are. So I think the best thing we could do in this discussion, with all due respect to those around the table, are like, that shouldn't happen at all, is to give the counties the flexibility, decide whether or not to use them, but to work on what do we think, what could we put in place to make sure the places that aren't using them feel comfortable that there's not some sort of chicanery going on out there. That's my hope as to where we can move. That's the compromise that I think hopefully we could suggest to the legislators, to be the vanguard, be the ideas and say, hey, you know, my job doesn't rest on whether or not the voters back home are happy. I'll continue to practice law, do the V transfers, and there you go. So I feel like I can go out on a limb here and say, maybe I'm not a fan of this personally, but again, in the name of compromise, I can do it. So I would just, from my personal perspective, we spend our best time not talking about whether drop boxes are to be used or not to be used. We spend our best time talking about if counties want to use them, what's that level playing field? What's the universal thing we can all agree upon have to be done so that people have confidence?
I was thinking exactly what Jesse said, but I wasn't thinking it half as clearly as he said.
That being said, I have absolutely no idea as to what substantive security could be put in place to create that feeling of confidence. I can only, to quote the many great philosophers, I don't know the answers, but I know the questions. And that's kind of where I'm at.
In Berks County, I know that we have three drop boxes in the county. They are manned by deputy sheriffs who will stand there while they're there, and then an election official will go out at the end of every day, and they will together open the lock, each with a separate key, open the drop box, and they will remove the ballots. They'll wrap a security zip tie around it that has a serial number on it, and they both write down what the serial number is, and the next day when they show up, they confirm that the same serial number, the same bag came back. And I would just say I'd be open to the idea of drop boxes being embedded in the statute, provided only that there were adequate security measures to make sure that people who are wary of them are assured that it's safe.
So, and I saw a reference somewhere in some of the language that we read through, but if I were ever mandated to do that, one of the requirements that I would place on my staff is that I have a bipartisan team collecting those ballots.
That's done in a number of jurisdictions.
Yes. The only other thing I would say is, back to Christina's point, as far as I know, we don't have drop boxes to drop off our income taxes yet. And until such time as we do, and not everybody can. Not too much confinement, I can still do it.
Pull up to the post, I used to pull up to the Market Street Post Office because they had employees working until midnight on April 15th, and you could hand your package, get a stamp.
Right. So there's a deadline,
Mhm.
and we have a deadline for elections. We've always had a deadline for elections. Again, there's some personal responsibility to making sure you meet that deadline. You can't always do everything for everyone. There has to be deadlines, just like there's an election day.
I think following back to what James was saying, looking at the chain of custody and creating a clear chain of custody with a bipartisan team, or when a bipartisan team is not available, perhaps sheriffs or deputized people that are independent. Or I mean, the tricky thing when you say bipartisan, does that mean it needs to be a Democrat and a Republican, or can it be a Republican and an independent? What are we getting at when we say bipartisan? So that's another issue, but I think that having bipartisan team do the pickups. The other thing that I think is really important is having the boxes be in a spot that is not movable. So like I know in Delaware County, we have a lot of boxes, and all of our boxes are secured concrete. They're permanent installations. each one has its own solar array that has 24-hour video surveillance. They are picked up nightly. They are locked on election day. It's bipartisan teams. There's a secure chain of custody. So I think those are the steps that need to go into ensuring that there's a chain of custody and security surrounding these boxes. You can't just, you don't want to have, I know that one of the conversations, and I think it was written in the document, was the ability of maybe just putting drop boxes in precincts that are like mobile. So I think that's a horrible idea, because I wouldn't, judges of election have a busy day on election day. Things get lost in polling precincts. They're going to be found in the cages with the equipment 3 or 4 days later. That's a mess. Keeping them in an area where they're secure and they go back to central, because that's where they're counted, is what I think is more important.
This is a big enough topic, even as we like a whiteboard to start like putting down category, because I mean, there are a bunch of categories. I agree, like they need to go to statute. It's big enough for infrastructure now. Some of these big categories are going statute, but they're like categories of, chain of custody, collection, monitoring that could go up there. Yeah, I mean, I'll name a couple of things that haven't yet, but are going to
So you're gonna put them on the tape, and then we're gonna go and try that.
Yeah, just brainstorming together.
But for dealers, before you do that, how many this Philadelphia?
This time, I don't know how many we will have this time, but I think the last election was 17, if I'm correct. Ideally, of course, I would like to have one per ward, as mentioned. But they are all, they're bolted into the ground. They all have their own video surveillance camera over them.
Are the ballots left in the drop boxes overnight, or do they come out?
Sorry, Patrick. I agree with that. Whiteboard, like the whiteboard.
I mean, this group topic will still be helpful. I guess for the record, I'll go through the list just to make sure we don't miss anything, or if there's something I don't need, something I don't want to get away. Something around accessibility, location and number is already named. Hours of operation, public notice, nothing's been named yet, monitoring has been named. Security, and I guess there are a number of things very good. The receptacles themselves, chain of custody was named, collection was named already. Signage is something that other states have. And then the last two are watchers, observers, and electioneering, which I know we'll talk about the point of this conversation, but those are some of the categories that at least you guys listed in which states, and that I think probably across most of those categories, we want to have some amount of statute, not a ton, but small amount.
Well, some things like temporality, maybe look at the counties, like how long do you want to have the drop boxes out? A week before the election, 2 weeks before the election, election day only, 5 days before the election, maybe those things could be left in the county. I think we should discuss what should be left to the county versus what should be statute.
I think you said something, and again, I don't have one, so I don't know the answer. I'm asking for feedback from everyone that has them. Has anybody had issues of, I don't want to say electioneering, but poll watchers standing outside the drop boxes or political signs? They have to be so many feet away, just like a polling location. I mean, all of those issues that you deal with at a polling location, do they come into play with drop boxes? Should they?
We would have to put them in this, if we wanted to do that, I think we would have to put them in the statute. And your drop box is kind of a polling place, so why?
Yeah.
At the time you're at the drop box, you already voted.
Your ballots.
It is not a polling.
There are no rules. There are literally no rules. In statute. But legally, a host of voters or concerned voters could sit in their lawn chairs all day long and sit and watch people going to deposit their votes.
And harass them.
Someone could be carrying a sandwich board that says vote time. And, look menacing. There are no rules, and that's, it gets back to my other point where people consider the polling place kind of like the stone of security and integrity and that sort of thing. And it just doesn't exist around drop boxes in the minds of many people.
Your question was, I guess, what have the experiences been? I guess at least in Pennsylvania today with these things. I mean, and we've in Philly, we've had a couple instances of like with like video recording, but otherwise, yeah. Otherwise, I can't recall like anyone nearby, because some are computer ballot. There's nothing to persuade them.
Level of persuasion.
There's no committee people like shoving sand ballots in their face when they're walking.
So what happened in those instances when people would take a picture of people at drop boxes? Anything?
Yeah, the police were called, and because they were intimidating, people at that's fine.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess that was the allegation. I mean, I guess the thing is though, like you said, Dropbox or not statute, none of this is regulated, and I guess we could try. I guess electioneering is one of the bigger things we could try to regulate. We can split it, whether it's 10 feet or whatever. And the funny thing is, I don't think there's not too much electioneer around when someone's just dropping off the ballot like that. But as far as like someone out,
Unless they stick a sticker on the box,
That's what I was thinking.
avoid the entire box. Because.
oh, so sticker says someone takes the box.
Yeah, put a sticker.
Sounds like prohibiting them. Well, that should be, that's paper the buck. I think that should be.
But the next voter who comes then says, well, somebody was electioneering, so I felt violated. You see what I'm saying? It's,
So why were the people in Philadelphia arrested if they weren't intimidating? I'm sorry, you said they were intimidating people from doing what?
If they were intimidating.
Did you have instances where people were intimidated from approaching a Dropbox because of
Some
people
people may
around?
have felt the level of intimidation by another person being there. Even the videos.
We had that in Montgomery County as well. I mean, people, you walk up and someone's standing there holding the phone saying, what are you doing with that? I mean, that's intimidating.
Yeah, I agree, but that's to us.
yeah.
But there are no rules.
Anybody walk away and not put their ballot in the box. Because that would be the primary concern, I would think, is did that person, rather than intimidation, make that person say, oh, I better not put my ballot in this box. And then maybe they don't vote at all. But see how they fill out the ballot and what it's do.
Well,
They know on the other side, where any of those people charged for that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a police, I don't know what, to your point, I mean, I don't know what the regulation is against that. Because there is.
It's not a law.
I mean, but we're hearing now that we have folks who want to watch the boxes 24/7. So, we would have people in the middle of the night out there. So, which is why we're probably going to go back to man to at least try to have someone there to.
And again, if you have drop boxes, you can make the decision what hours they're open, correct?
Yeah, in 2020, when we ran, they were 8 days a week, but they've been 24/7, but you can't have it now. 7.
Well, maybe you have a man when there are ballots in the box. Through the last election cycle in 2022, in the primary.
Well, they would get picked up every night.
I think there wasn't a person at every Dropbox.
The other thing I was just suggesting, if folks are being posted up across the street, just watching, I mean, as long as that behavior doesn't move into harassment or intimidation, which is subjective, right?
Yeah, what
So-
intimidation, what somebody
Well,
feels is intimidating or harassing.
It'd
is
be,
different than somebody else.
that's the same challenge at a point place right now, like when will that behavior start to move into harassment or intimidation territory, and then it would be forceful, but yeah, if someone's just posted across the street and watch, I don't think that's something we need to regulate.
You're right, it's completely subjective because quite frankly, when I go to vote, sometimes I feel harassed by the people who are legally standing 10 feet from the polling place. Because I don't believe that's for me, there's a sanctity around voting, so I feel harassed by that, so it's. People are completely like. But seriously, I mean, to your point, it's extremely subjective. And I would agree with most people in my opinion. public field decision about those people who are legally electioneering beyond the 10-foot line. So it's very subjective, but without any standards in statute, you're going to get it subjective where somebody might be 50 feet down the street and look at the wrong way, and somebody goes, well, I'm calling the cops because that person was looking at me when else. You have to have some standards written in the statute, if in fact you are going to utilize these processes.
Speaking of that 10-foot, we are I think Pennsylvania and a few other states in the Northeast are the only states with a 10-foot barrier. Almost every other state has a minimum of 50, and I think most states on the West Coast are. So that's definitely something that maybe.
We'll come back and talk about
Yeah, in person, yeah, that's a real issue.
That's hard to do when some of your polling places are right adjacent to another product.
Right.
If you can't regulate what's happening.
So one of the issues that you brought up, Pat, is the choice of location. I just wanted, for reference point, that's an issue before Act 77 came into being that we discussed many, many times at the CCAP selection committee, because that was a concern. I can remember Craig Lehman and myself being on the same side of this issue. It's like, no matter where you choose, put a drop box, you are going to be accused of making the political advantage one way or another. And I'd stick by that, because there's so many things that come into play. If it's outside the courthouse or outside the MDJ's office, but even that could be considered, political location strategy. You're going to have those issues, so that's going to be really tough to regulate.
I mean, it happens with point place change. Every time you change a point door location, like someone's upset about that.
Knock on wood, I'm knocking on wood. Hard. Of all the things we've been accused of, we have not been accused of that. We had 14, no one has ever said that we positioned them for any kind of political benefit. We did it by geography. And we use GIS to do that, so we could back that up. So it'll happen this afternoon now, but
Say you're not wrong.
well, that's why we have that 14.
Exactly.
We're a large county in population, but also land. We made sure some of them, if you look, it doesn't necessarily, but we made sure that everyone is within 20 minutes.
Again, part of the argument against wherever you put them is you have a mailbox right outside your door. Everybody does.
We have a mail system that is increasingly lacking in dependency.
And everybody doesn't have a mailbox.
Well, right.
And I live on the border of Delaware and Chester. My mailing address is in Chester County, even though I live in Delaware. So my mail, if I have to go pick something up in my post office, it's 8 miles away. Yet the post office that is closest to me, there are 3 post offices that are closer to me in the vicinity, but they are not my post office, so I can't go to them. So I think that the idea of just telling people you use the postal service doesn't fit that need, especially if we're getting ballots to them late for whatever, maybe there was a change to the ballot last minute, someone's name was thrown off, it can be printed in time. We need to make exceptions for those people to ensure that they people have the ability to test the ballot. And that's, I think, where the drop boxes really do come into play. And I personally am a fan of 24-hour drop boxes. Every time I've gone to, I work the polls, so I'm always dragging my ballot to, I usually sometimes work at polls that are not in my precinct, so I can't vote at polls. I'm dropping my ballot off at 3:30 in the morning, heading out to the polls and doing what I need to do. I think that service needs to be available.
Like somebody asked me earlier, I think I said 14, we had 17.
You said so.
I'm sorry, I
I think we have 37.
think we have 40.
Yes. We have, I think 37 are operational. There were,
I believe that originally you had them in every township, but then some townships said they did not.
we have 47 municipalities, and all 47 were offered a drop box, and 37 took them up. Some municipalities are really small geographically, they didn't have the space for the areas. They're in the libraries and township buildings outside of those areas are very popular spots, and they're used for frequency. And they're used in areas that are very heavily Republican and very heavily Democratic and very heavily independent. And there was one of the communities in Delaware County, actually, the supervisors voted to remove the drop boxes, and the citizens said, no, put back, and they did. Because citizens used it, so it really. And it's so neat. So I mean, hopefully we can create some regulations with regards to chain of custody. I know that in Delaware County, we're doing a really great job with that custody, with surveillance and ensuring that they're kept safe. But, you know, if those protocols need to be in place from a legislative perspective, to ensure that the usability is a possibility.
I guess until just trying to anchor down, some places, sorry, I think like the number would be as simple as anything. So again, if there has been something has to go in statute. And it seems like from the conversation that we had before, that number is definitely not, number of drop boxes per X number of voters. It's not 10. There's no minimum. Oh, so I was in the minimum part, right? Probably have even a minimum of one, but not. We get consensus around. But I guess I figured I put that out there for discussion for of all the categories, just number of drop boxes. Should there be any specificity around that, or
Assuming that we come to the conclusion that they're mandatory.
I guess I will be a good question. To the consensus that they should go on statute, but they're not mandatory, and that the county doesn't want to have a drop box. I guess that's the question. There even be a minimum of one.
Which would be
If you're gonna let it optional, you can't have
Yeah. Well, and this is something that was got early on after I-77 in our election meetings. So if I were going to be forced to have a drop box, before I get to that point, I would rather be forced to accept mail-in ballots at the polling locations. Because that's getting it back to the local constitutional, you must have a polling place in your precinct. And it's getting back to closest to the voter. And if you want to talk about where to put drop boxes, that's the fail-safe method, where nobody can complain now because it's at your polling location. No different than if you went there to vote in person.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, I mean, if not just on security grounds, then just beat up like a control system. We got 1,700 precincts and affiliate at 900 locations. That's a lot of different places for the ballot to be going. Which is because I wrote when this came up in the legislature, I would trust with that, but Lisa would probably have more to say about that than I would. It's just it's a lot of different places for these ballots.
Yeah, and it's a whole chain of custody.
Yeah, actually, that's right. Chain of custody going up.
Well, I'm saying just on election day, not before.
Right.
So you have staff.
because they have to go back to the
county.
So I know. I mean, it'd be a totally different story if we're not counting the census.
Right, so what happens if you've got your judge of election at the end of the night? If instead of putting the bag with those mail-in ballots, or those ballots that have been delivered, instead of bringing that bag back to the county, they accidentally seal it in the equipment, and it's not found when the equipment is returned to the county. Then you've got ballots that were, they arrived timely, but they're not time stamped because
Right.
poll workers aren't time stamping them, and then you're giving your poll workers another job. Are they then gonna have to timestamp and verify everything?
Oh, if you did that, there'd have to be a
Yeah.
whole nother set of processes that need work.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm not saying I'm in favor of that,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I'd rather do that than work out a drop box somewhere.
Well, maybe that's where the compromise consensus, right, which there is no requirement that the county have even right to even one county. But if a county is gonna have even just one or multiple, these are the rules to apply.
And that's what I think I'm generally hearing people say is that the county can decide. The statute should say that drop boxes are defined as this, and they can be, but are not required to be used by counties. The number and location is up to the county with these parameters, and you spell out your guidelines on how you have this much, responsibility for, security and even have options within that, but to have parameters spelled out in the statute. So if you say, okay, I want to have a Dropbox in Snyder County, you look to the statute and you say, okay, I have to do X, Y, and Z to make this function properly. And then you're good to go. And yes, there are, I mean, I think fundamentally, there are some fairness concerns that, you know, if Delaware County, anybody can go to 37 drop boxes, and let's imagine Snyder is next door and they have none, then you're gonna have people complain, well, that's not fair, they get to do it, but they don't. But if that is an issue for you, then go to your county commissioners and tell them, this is what we want. But you had people who said, we don't want. But at that point, it's the voters talking to their elected representatives about what they think would work best in their community. So anyway, that's what I think I'm hearing, that we put it in the statute. Counties can decide on their own, but if they decide on their own, then X, Y, Z must be done. And we can write that, and we can write some different options to go into all of those subcategories that Pat's mentioning, that then you can see in front of you, read and say, okay, I can live with this, I can live with this. Because bottom line is, most of the decisions that we make with this agency and around this table are, what can I live with? Nobody wins the lottery in these kind of meetings and discussions. Nobody gets 100% what they want. And that's the goal, that nobody gets 100% what they want, because we haven't done our job right, because we haven't had some compromise, some concessions, some negotiation to get to consensus. So that's what I'm hearing consensus is around this issue, with a lot of details to be filled in.
Well,
Yes,
and-
no?
and yes, but
Okay,
I'm still hung up on the fact that for in-person voting in Commonwealth, the requirement is that there be at least one precinct per municipality. We have a borough in Lawrence County that has 10 registered voters. Borough, SMPJ, and it's a whole long story that I won't bore you with, as to how it became a borough. But at most, we have 10 registered voters in that borough. But we are obligated for in-person voting, that we have a polling place at that location for them to vote. And so consequently, we have a polling place at each municipality, and then obviously based on population. And I think that my recollection is the guidelines are, a polling place should have a minimum of 300, a maximum of 1,200. I may have those numbers wrong. There's guidelines for the size of the municipality. But my point is that in terms of non-ADA accessibility, it's like she doesn't, I looked at your word accessibility, which uses the word ADA, and that's a whole other issue we can talk about, obviously. But what I would characterize as non-ADA accessibility for people who vote in person, it's pretty fair. Because within a fairly close distance, you have access to a polling place at which you can go and vote in person. And my concern is that, can you replicate that with drop boxes? And it sounds as though in Montgomery County, you made an effort to do that, obviously, a very sophisticated effort based on how you described it. But I would still argue that unless you have that box available municipality by municipality or ward by ward, and in an ideal world, that would be the best solution. Now, from a practical standpoint, it's going to be awfully expensive and very difficult to achieve, given the number of municipalities or wards within a particular county. So, but I'm still hung up on that in terms of fairness to the people who choose to vote that way, in terms of how easy it is, because however you structure this, it's going to be easy for some and hard for others. And there's a disparity there.
but I
You
think,
made a great point there. People are choosing
Yes.
So if you're choosing to vote by mail, here are the options. And you can drive 5 miles to a drop box, you can use the United States Postal Service, or you can bring it back to the county office. Because if that's your choice to vote by mail, here are your options. If not, then you can choose to vote in person and walk up around the block and go to the in-person poll.
And it may be a matter of prioritizing the methods of voting. And that in person is your primary method of voting, and these other options are available. But if you choose that option, you take that option with whatever inconveniences it brings with it, and that you make the judgment between which method is more convenient.
It would be different if we went all mail. We were gonna be an all mail state and we aren't gonna offer it, but that's not what we're just offering a variety of options for which we were to exercise. If you wish to vote by mail, here's how you can do it, here's how you can get back your ballot. If you don't like that, you can go vote in person. There are your options.
And you can go yell at your commissioners if you don't like what they're doing in your county. My dad was a township supervisor. People were pulling up in front of our house to bitch at the roads all the time. Sorry, audience. So, yeah, I mean, that, especially in these smaller communities, you corner your commissioners and your supervisors at the local diner and tell them.
I'm not sure if that's already what the commissioner.
But it goes back to the statute. If you're going to argue for a point, then it darn well better be in statute. You're gonna try and make me do that.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
if
so-
it doesn't tell me to do it, you know, then you're back, may, shall, would, could.
One
will.
of your voters comes to you and says, Joe, I'm sick of this, I want a drop box. Say,
I say that I run for commissioner and get
yeah,
one. Seriously.
exactly, or, you know, show me the law that says I have to. If you don't like it, run against me.
Yeah.
In the next election, but I mean, that's. Everybody has to be responsible for themselves, and you ultimately make your own decisions and your own choices, and that's your right as a citizen of the community. And if everything is spelled out and laid out in front of you, that you have full information and you can make a knowledgeable choice, then choose to do what you want to do.
Still a little bit frightened by that privilege.
Yeah, that's persuasive of us.
In person. And that's. Delightful. Hey, Glenn sitting down behind his mask like, oh, we're gonna get her.
But, if it's a relatively small number of ballots, and you got limited resources, I mean, that's the other thing, but look, we only had a couple hundred ballots. We gotta pay for X, Y, Z other things, we just, you know, this is investment we we made. At least if you pull back all the drop boxes, still, we got 450 of those things being passed in the election, like, you're gonna get your head bit off, so I mean, I think that's where the.
And that goes back to the whole premise of Act 77. You're never gonna get rid of mail-in ballots because it's got them now. If I put a drop box out there, we're gonna get rid of it. But it's going to cost my taxpayers more money. So unless I see it in statute. And again, I'm not belittling the counties that have it, that's their choice in that, but they're paying for that choice, and that's their choice to do that.
So I withdraw my earlier statement saying it should be mandatory. I'd be fine with it being optional by county, but I would still like to have some. I would like to have guidance that we want to. Yes. Yeah, right.
I do have concerns about drop boxes. Many of my concerns have been echoed about the table. But one of the reasons why I like what Yvonne said, and I think we're all moving towards, which is you want to have them, you can choose to have them, but you have to follow these requirements. Is that currently there are no requirements? It's bottom up, so even if that is concerns, That guidance, is exactly that guidance, Department of State has no, all due respect, Department of State.
When we're writing. Put it in statute. We're certainly gonna look at Department of State's guidance and see if there are procedures that meet what you've all said you wanna see. So, I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. They got good stuff in Department of State. We'll take it.
Yeah, and I would like to see it done statutorily because you all are using the keyword guidance. As I constantly tell my local board of elections, you guys run the operations in this county, not those friends back in Harrisburg. You as the county board of elections, you have the authority. That's where it's supposed to lie for 90% of them. I would like to see us be able to take,
We are still all sitting around this table.
well,
I'm talking nice.
yes, and I would like to see I be able to go back to the people in my community and say, those are friends of ours across the state, they've chosen to use drop boxes, it's their choice. Before we pass these rules and these statutes, they could largely do whatever they wanted. If they didn't want to have them monitored, if they didn't want to have them picked up every day, they could do whatever they want. But we moved the ball forward because now there are hard requirements that if they want to use them, this is what they have to do. And let's see how they work. And maybe we need to do some changes to strengthen them or weaken them with time. But again, I think I would say to my conservative brothers and sisters, this deal that we're talking about is better than where we are now. And I don't want perfect to be the enemy. I just want to move it forward in the way that we go.
It's the same premise as the grant we just accepted at the county. Any county that signed the one said, we'll take the money, state, but here's the list of criteria we will meet in order to accept that money.
And in fact, that was one of the pieces we included, that you can take the surety too, that if you're gonna do the election integrity grants, you know what you're getting into and what you're promising and what you're committing to. So, that was part of the preparation for that piece, because it is a real big thing. And, we wanted everybody to have that information. All right, related to the drop boxes is the issue of who can return a ballot to the drop box. Because you have, I've got 5 registered voters in my household. I can carry all 5 mail-in ballots to the post office and throw them in the bin out my car window. No big deal. But if you show up at a drop box and you return your ballot and you return a family member's ballot, there are some people who would call that an illegal vote when you've done that. So my question is, are we going to try to make the drop boxes akin to a mailbox when you're returning ballots? Or are we going to maintain, reinforce, reiterate that only the voter can use the drop box for their ballot?
But Yvonne, to be clear, you broke the law when you did it in the mailbox. When you took
Yeah.
it, but
Yeah,
no one
no.
knows. The only reason anyone knows it, when you do it in a Dropbox, is because 1, it's manned, or 2, there's video surveillance. So that's what I talk about when people focus on the Dropbox is why would you come to a Dropbox under video surveillance with 5 ballots as opposed to going to the post office?
True, very true. So I bring it up because I want to hear responses to that. I want to hear what you all think about that, because under whatever circumstances, the post office, the drop box, you are technically creating an election law violation. And if you're going to prosecute those, you could end up with losing your voting rights. If you're convicted of, I forgot what level election law violation, it's like a 3rd-class felony. So how do we want to do about those people? What do we want to do to deal with those people who are going to the videotape Dropbox and returning multiple ballots. Grandpa took kids and grandmas in.
I think that a question before that would be, what is considered ballot harvesting and what is considered being helpful to your spouse? So I think that like there needs to be a definition, like the idea behind the bill, written the way it was, seems to be to prevent ballot harvesting. Which would be someone requesting a number of ballots, having them sent to a PO box and doing God knows what with them with nefarious intent. You're bringing your husband or your daughter's mail-in ballot to a Dropbox does not have that same level of nefarious intent. So is there willingness to even open that up for discussion?
Household 1,300 and household 1,800, both allowed. One person from the household, taking anybody else who was in that household, registered to vote in that house, and making that open.
Feel like that? I'm just general, does that sound like a?
Yes, I do that. That's important.
The only hitch was, there's a lot of other stuff connected in that bill.
Yeah.
And it was part of
Anybody dropping off would actually be signing for a book when they drop off, that I think was like, just like really, yeah.
We don't have to walk here.
I don't recall if that's, I don't think that's. Right.
I think any citizen would think that it's more than reasonable that a
Yeah.
household member that you could drop off their ballot. And I believe that most people probably don't even know that they're breaking the
The
law.
law.
Oh, yeah.
They're not doing the same.
I think the trouble you run into, that sort of provision, is a nursing home a household. And I don't believe either of those bills address that. Okay.
One of our members, who isn't here right now, I can't remember who it was very concerned about that issue.
Yeah. Oh, I know how we get there. We actually, put in statute that the counties could put remote teams together to go out and actually do mail-in voting day or whatever you want to call it at nursing home facilities like that. But that is one of the hitches of that household thing is that, well, if you're already doing that, how do you consider that nursing home? Everybody has the same class.
But currently though, for a nursing home, then you have to get a designated agent form. And so you can do that now, but there's an additional form that the voter would have to sign, and you have to turn in with their ballot that to say.
For mail-in.
For,
Currently in the election law is a provision for election teams to go out and have basically a temporary polling place at county institutions where they can run the election for the residents of that institution and bring the ballots back. The problem, as it's been explained to me, is most of the nursing home facilities are no longer county owned. So it's private
Right.
institutions, but we could take that language and have it applicable to any kind of congregate living situation where the county could take a team on, not necessarily election day, but a designated day to go and allow those people to vote. And that would address some of the concerns about ballot harvesting that you have in some of these facilities where the social worker sent in the applications, the social worker got the ballots back, the social worker sat with each person and helped them fill out the ballot and then brought them back. Because you would have, and that ought to address, if you have a place in the facility that the residents can come to, even bedridden residents can be put in a wheelchair and go downstairs, is, the competency issues of some people who may not be declared legally competent, but also would be plain to an election worker that they did not understand why they were there and what they were doing. So that would address some of those issues.
I think enforceability is an issue with having, even if our intention is to allow a family member or a member of a household deliver 5 or 6 or 10 ballots to a drop box, how do you really determine that those people are members of that household before they're put into the drop box?
I forget what I was just saying, that's, and it might be you, that's my nightmare as well, is you have a situation with adult children living at home and there's domestic violence in the home. And whatever parent is the dominant person is making everybody get a ballot, lining them up around the kitchen table and saying, this person you're voting this way, this person you're voting this way.
And I'll take them to the ballot, to the drop box for you.
Yes.
That's another concern.
Yeah.
Drop box
So-
or PO box.
Anywhere.
And how do you enforce it? I would like to be able to understand before I would support that, how we propose to enforce that. I just can't imagine.
But I don't know how you enforce it now. I mean, we literally had the governor say that the First Lady took his ballot for him. And as far as I can tell, the governor has not been prosecuted.
And if all five of us
I
put
mean,
it
that's,
out in their mailbox, how would you?
Yeah, I agree.
Or
It's,
even when it comes to that like domestic abuse issue, like I was saying earlier, that person could still vote in precinct and still be under the same level of duress in precinct. And still be forced to vote the way that their abuser is telling them to vote. So it doesn't fix, it doesn't, it's like, you know, people that are under that kind of duress and abuse are, you know, most. They're gonna do what that person is abusing them is telling them to do.
we had
Just
it,
because
we had it in secrecy. Up until we changed the law that let people take a photo in the poll, which I was against for that very reason. Because now if you have somebody under someone's thumb and they say, I want you to take a picture of your ballot before you walk out, or I'm gonna beat you. I mean, that can happen. And up until we had that law changed, you weren't allowed to take a picture of it. Where you're supposed to take your phone in.
To the chairman, it's happening right now,
But we shouldn't be,
But
you can't draft legislation
but
based on, it's already happening
The way to do it-
at one location. So let's expand that practice.
the
to
reason
other
why it's in the
locations.
code is to eliminate ballot harvesting, not to prevent a husband from taking his wife's ballot to the mailbox.
Nobody here is against the idea of a husband taking his
So-
wife's ballot.
So the best that what we can do is ensure that the husband who's taking his wife's ballot to the mailbox is not unwittingly breaking the law, but still ensure that the person who's ballot harvesting hundreds of ballots is still held accountable and still taking the test. If
Or
we
10 each
say,
day, or 10 each day,
or if we say, you can hold for 10 each day.
or 5 each
If
day.
we, or 3 each day, or 1 each day is irrelevant. If we say that a member of a, same member of the household, period. So it's eliminates the ballot harvesting, it makes it illegal for somebody to go into an apartment building and go collect everybody's ballots. It's 1 per household.
Makes it illegal, but it doesn't prevent it. To Joe's point earlier, and having security cameras is great for criminal law enforcement, but it does nothing to prevent what we're trying to prevent, which is ballot harvesting. So my point is, even though it's happening at PO boxes, doesn't mean isn't justification for expanding that open potential to.
It's like speed cameras. Speed cameras, they don't eliminate people speeding. But they curtail the number of people that are speeding because there is there will be enforcement.
The
So,
speeder who's caught does not ruin the entire rest of everybody else's audit. The voter who is caught cheating ruins everyone else's vote.
I don't think it's a very good example, I'll just agree with that. But I'm just concerned about if we're going to allow, whether it happens as a practical sense or not, if we're going to discuss permitting one person taking other people's ballots, nobody in this room opposes the idea of me taking my wife's ballot or my wife taking my ballot or my kids. The exceptions or the concerns that Yvonne brought up in the back seat for now. The concern is, how do we know if we open the door for me walking up and being seen on the security camera for dropping off 5, 6, 10? How do we know that any number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 through 10 are actually members of my household? It's easier to enforce it if you're just carrying one. I'm not opposed to the idea of a spouse carrying or a person carrying other members of their household. But how does the legislature, restrict, contain that to its intention? Is my point.
Yeah, but let me illustrate that by saying, as it stands now, if you were some vigilant citizen who thought this was a problem, you could stand near a drop box, not intimidating anybody, but you could remind them, if they have 2 or more ballots in their hand, that they're only allowed to drop one in. If we change that, now that vigilant citizen who wants to make sure the law is doesn't have any clue which other ballots you have. And I think that illustrates your point. It's like, as it stands now, everybody knows the visual is one person, one vote in the drop.
Or a deputy sheriff in Berks County.
Exactly.
Looking for one person, one envelope.
Exactly.
Not one.
Exactly.
And 9 others that haven't been identified or connected with that person.
Video camera stops leaving.
I think it may be because the camera is a security safeguard, not for this particular issue, but more to protect the Dropbox itself in terms of tampering and vandalism damage. And from what I understand, in other states, like California, where they've had problems with this, is like when they codify ballot collection, ballot harvesting, and it is legal for operators to go around and start a couple dozen ballots at a time. Which obviously, I don't think anyone's proposing that here.
Did you say legal or
It'll be illegal. It's
legal.
yes,
Yeah.
ballots, which again, if someone proposed, I don't think anyone that here. But in terms of the security for who can return that ballot, I mean, part of it is ballot tracking, and voters applied, local officials, state officials know like where the ballots are at any given time. I think there should also be a paper trail as well, which right now in the designated agent form, the voter has to sign that, but the agent does too. And I don't know why, if we were to choose the law to so you can return the ballot for someone in your household, if I'm returning my ballot for my wife, I think I'd have to sign on her envelope at Christmas. I'm returning my wife's ballot. And I'd have to do that for anyone else in the envelope, just like you have to right now with the agent form. But I think, and that's what I see, there are multiple safeguards, and there's no perfect system, but there have to be multiple checks along the way. I mean, just like, and then there, again, where folks have gotten in trouble with some sort of scheme, I mean, it's because there's been something systematic, like the pattern has popped up, and that's why we know that we got in trouble. But I think, I mean, at least I'm sure this time we'll both agree, we would not want to codify law, my ability to go up and down the block, scooping up people's ballots, right? Which is why I'm not talking about that.
So would everybody be comfortable with that household return if we put in a requirement that the person returning it sign it as well? So you would have a way to track it.
And the outer envelopes are saved, they aren't kept, so if there are. But
Yeah.
all of this is. The very first time that someone is found guilty of, say, for example, I know in our case, there was a gentleman who voted by mail for his dead mother. And he was charged with felony, he has lost his voting rights. So I think that those are the things that you need to have a reason why you are not going to do this. And it's not enough to just create a safeguard and to just say, oh, we're gonna create these safeguards and put these safeguards in place so people won't do that. Somebody's going to try to do it anyway. And the thing is to make sure that when that person is caught, that they are criminally prosecuted to the fullest extent, so that that sends a message in itself to others that this is not acceptable.
I agree with that. It's a great form of deterrence to others, but I would like to have it caught before the vote is cast in the county, if possible.
So just for everyone's knowledge, if you forget, I'm looking at the outside of the ballot, and currently you have the place for the voter to sign and date. But underneath that, I mentioned to some of us here earlier, if you're unable to sign the declaration because of illness or physical disability, you can have your mark, or you can have someone else with a witness sign that as well, and they would return that ballot. But why couldn't you incorporate what we're talking about as well? So it's someone who has someone returning it for them in that same box. And then there's just a either or scenario. I don't know, just throwing it
I
out.
think that's the way it works.
That was, I think, your.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
because it's already there. We just have to change the language a little. The Department of State has to change the language. a little. Our friends in Harris Group.
We're so at the. Even the one pathway for folks with the designated aid, you got to download the PDF, you got to print it. And I don't think anyone's clear on like where exactly that form goes. I mean,
Bundle it up.
yeah, some folks put it inside the envelope, some folks get it separate in the Dropbox, some folks like me hand it over the counter, it's separate, and it should be on an envelope. Yeah. Like much cleaner for the
Yeah, I think I've wrapped it around. I've done lots of them, for people that, whether it was an emergency ballot or, sign the. Whatever the emergency carrier, or when we had COVID, I had one hazmat suit, like, whatever, to make sure that we get the vote in, but. It's one of the documents.
Right, that's. To see if there's something that would fit easily into the statute, or if you have to write it in a way that says Department of State make this happen. But I did work with that. I'm not the same.
Let's see the statute.
I like to see things in statute. Yeah.
I know I walked into the middle of the conversation, I apologize for having to step out. And I'm gonna, this is splitting hairs, but in the discussion about that second signature, do we know, does the current statute require that that individual also be a registered voter? And if not, should that person be a registered voter?
I don't know. I don't know.
And what other information, what other verifiable information should be included with their signature? Their address, the address of the person that they're submitting for?
For the emergency, when you make an application for an emergency absentee ballot at the last minute, does that person who is assisting you with that need to be registered voter?
I don't know the answer.
I'm not sure that's a deal.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
You guys already think of plenty of people who may be handicapped or whatever, who have somebody who is their aide, right? Who is, may not even be a citizen, so, yeah.
Stay or something like that.
Right, right.
I can't remember, sure.
and not the judge of elections, but there's nothing about the person, so you have a caregiver, and the caregiver is not in this country, and it's a person that help you, pick whoever you want, right?
And I think that now that you mention it, I think the statute actually does say something along those lines, that whoever you want. you can
So the
pick.
judge of elections, you represent.
It's like, I mean, this, the code's so old, it's like 1937, but you do kind of, there's certain spots that just like, they just recite them like clockwork. Like, I know that part.
Yeah, there are a couple of statutes from very early in the 20th century that prohibit union representatives from engaging in various activities. I don't think it's must have been a whole lot more.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel comfortable on that. How do you feel about the idea of expanding that language already in the statute that would allow teams to go into private nursing homes to conduct on-site elections?
To conduct an on-site election, collecting ballot.
It's basically like, it's the way it is now, it's state care home, or a county care home. They bring in crews, like either a Democrat or Republican, might have 5 teams, and they go room to room to assist people to fill out their mail-in ballots. So
Employees of the election office, or are these people from the?
these are
Parties.
volunteers from the parties. And that's the other question that I have when we talk about codifying any of this would be, right now it's bipartisan teams, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. Can that be adjusted in some way, shape, or form so that we maybe throw independence in there? If you don't have people that want to volunteer and you can't run it because you don't have enough volunteers in one party, what do you do?
I think you can probably write something along the language that the 2 people are not affiliated with the same party.
Okay.
Something like that, so that you could pull in an independent and an R, or Green Party and a D, or whatever. But you could
Yeah,
just,
so it's too.
you do it in the negative, 2, but not the same party. And then that gives you more flexibility.
I don't know how to fix this problem, but as a relatively conservative guy, I don't think I'd feel comfortable with a member of the Democratic Green Party. I don't know how you fix this. I don't know how to fix it properly. Well, but I agree that it's.
Party, let's see.
Yeah, I mean, maybe my Democratic friends would feel similar if it was a Republican or Libertarian, because those parties overlap in some issues. So I agree that in this world where registration in the 2 major parties is going down and there is more independence and more third parties, that it should be opened up. But like I said, I think what we're trying to get is an ideological, there's people who are on kind of different sides. Maybe if you look at 1 through 10, 10's your hard Republican, 1's your hard Democrat, maybe like a 4 and a 6 would be okay, at least they're on the opposite side. But the way we're writing it, you could allow 2 people that are both very, very crazy conservatives, and I don't think my Democratic friends would feel comfortable just if one of them happens to be a constitutional party member and the other was a Republican. So again, just something.
Let me ask the attorneys a question. Is a registered independent a member of a political party?
No, so that's why I would say that they're not from the same party, not having other members, that would make it clear that no party affiliation would also be.
Which is the same for county boards of election and for election officers.
Not to muddy the waters, but I would have a hard time accepting anyone outside of the Republican or Democrat in the primary, just because it's their primary. That's a whole other issue. I don't want to go there, but
Well, Christine's gonna fix that and give us a
Yeah, I know.
primaries and then.
that's a whole day's discussion.
We're gonna have that day one day. We've got it forever. And so, I'm just gonna keep throwing topics at you until I'm dead, so. Just imagine, what are you talking about next week? No, not quite that bad, not quite.
But even the independents, when you think about it, you have a lot of registered independents that have very, very viewpoints where you could have two independents that are on complete opposite sides of the spectrum. Would that be meaningful? I mean, that they would be, in my opinion, a great team to go into a nursing home and do this work. But if they're registered of the same party, even though that party is technically not a party, that's not gonna work. So there does need to be some kind of, especially now, since most of these care homes are not under county rule. They're all, we have so many third-party care homes, personal care homes, nursing homes, and they're all.
And again, oh,
Joe,
sorry.
I'm sorry, I think you make a good point. The number of county-owned operated nursing homes is below 20 now.
Oh, it's 13, I think it's 13.
Okay.
Another one just dropped out, so I think.
Yeah, so that provision of the law right now, is very limited utility, but it could be expanded to help with all of the private. And you're getting more now that are continuum of care communities. And some of them, I know Bethany Village in Mechanicsburg, they have a polling place set up in their low income towers, and that's where everybody who's ambulatory goes to vote. They have their own polling place. So, but to get those nursing homes that don't, I'm looking at common interest communities right now. I mean, we're doing 55 plus communities being formed, and again, got to think about mobility issues, how those people are able to vote. So, I think,
I feel pretty strongly that there needs to be county election staff involved in that process.
yeah, yeah.
Because your county's going to have a set of guidelines that they're going to meet
Mhm.
to make sure everything's on the up and up.
That's why I think if we start with the language for the county institutions and build on it, we can come up with something that addresses these other concerns that come up when we get into private facilities.
And up until COVID, one of our polling places was at a senior care facility.
Mhm.
That's convenient.
We have many of them that way, and I lost one, not even dug down, like, the only thing about that, when you're talking about doing that, and should stand in these communities and stand in terms of the number, or in the county election board, again, it becomes a staffing and other nightmare issue logistically.
Well, I think it comes down to if your county, if this is a need in your county, then you should have the ability to provide it. But the discretion as to whether or not you should, based on the needs of your county, and not make it every county must provide this service to every nursing home or senior care facility or whatever, but to make it responsive to the county's needs.
I was just gonna ask Russ for funding and figured it'd be taken care of. Don't try it there. Invest the overestimate my own. There's a philosophy.
Get the postage on ballots now, so that's.
Yeah, I skipped over that for a minute to talk about drop boxes. And welcome. We can talk about that now. I think we decided a long time ago at a prior meeting that prepaid postage would just not work because especially in county election years, the size of the ballot is going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and the ballot in Lawrence County might be 4 sheets of paper, and the ballot in Montour County might be 1 sheet of paper. And so to do prepaid postage on that kind of stuff. My understanding was we did it once, kind of as an emergency situation with the pandemic. but that as an ongoing activity, most people did not support doing that. Now, we brought it back in here to make sure that was in fact the final consensus of the group, that it was something we didn't want to do in Pennsylvania, or that we didn't think we could afford to do in Pennsylvania. And I just want to get everybody's feedback that we read those signals correctly, and that there was not a consensus around prepaying the postage on mail-in ballots.
Yeah, I think it's the county's, it should be the county's choice. Personally, I don't think it should happen at all. I've said this many times, I think that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. If you pay postage for everyone's mail-in ballot, and those people that had to go drive to the polling place, to go drive to the polling place, have a valid concern that you paid somebody essentially to vote and you didn't pay me to vote. So why is that fair? It's only 55 cents or whatever the rate is anymore, I forget, but
If the postage is not paid, and correct me, Lisa, I know, and you may know this for certain, but if the postage is not fully paid on the ballot, and it comes back and there's an overage, that overage gets charged to the account, that's correct. So they're paying it anyway.
we didn't have a say in that.
Right,
It's an unfunded mandate.
So with the intent to make sure people weren't disenfranchised because they don't put up postage on their ballots, right?
But had the State Department not said, we're paying the postage, that would have never been an issue.
Yeah.
does the state pay that or just county pay that?
No, the county was forced to pay that.
So perhaps when we look at this, maybe we should send that back to the legislature and say, the counties are forced to pay this, the state should pay the county back or whatever that.
Or just make sure that the voter has to pay their own postage, which is the fair thing to do. And it would be more uniform. Because again, I'm not paying anyone gas money to get to the polling location.
I think asking one set of taxpayers, pay for the convenience. Remember, we did mail-in voting to provide convenient. To ask one group of taxpayers, pay for the convenience of another group of taxpayers.
Pay an awful lot of money for in person, really.
Now, I was just gonna say that, we look at, like, as Dan said earlier, he has a polling location with 10 people. And that's a mandate, that's so we're paying for so much now. Anyway. Just.
So I think that
Just
to a conversation that we're not quite ready to have in this group yet about moving toward more centralized voting centers. If you have the option of doing a mail-in ballot and you want to vote in person, then are you disadvantaged at all if you have to drive to the county seat to vote versus, in my case, walking across the street to the church across the street to vote? And that whole consideration of moving from precinct voting to voting center, whether that be county seat or multiple centers within a particular county, but generally consolidating those voting places that are available to people. And so, but that, again, Pennsylvania is not ready for that. I think I've heard from multiple people, Pennsylvania is not ready to go to voting centers yet, but I think some of the legislation that you were talking about did have voting center language in it.
I don't believe it had voting center language in it, although we did make provisions for the electronic poll books. That would be a precursor and prerequisite to go in to voting centers.
Yeah, and would that include some level of early voting as well then? True. True, early voting.
Well, 1,300 actually proposed multi-day early voting
Yes.
with initial implementation year 2025.
But to Lisa's point, if you're gonna have mail-in balloting, why have in-person voting at all? Then, if you're gonna go, why have a vote center if you just go all mail-in ballot?
I would agree, I would agree with that assessment.
You need to make everything accessible. A blind person is not able to vote at home by a mail-in ballot the same way that they would be able to vote at a voting center using an ADA compliant device.
Right.
So we're always going to need to have some level of vote center or in person just for those.
But in
Yeah,
theory, that could be a courthouse.
correct,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, for that reason, that makes
Yes.
sense.
That's a conversation way down there.
Right.
Because my personal option would be, we're gonna have vote centers with multi-day early voting. We don't need mail-in voting, absolutely.
It's one or the other.
Yeah, one or the other, because they're both very daunting to administer. And making this like,
Now, I would say in this whole postage subject, if you're gonna go eventually all mail-in ballot, you wanna pay for it then, it's fair. Right now, it's not fair to have that discussion.
I think, Grant, do you recall some of the states that are all mail-in ballots? Do they still reserve the ability to do in-person voting? Do you remember if that was?
Yeah. A couple of states, Colorado does. They do it on a county basis,
Yeah.
and they call, I don't know what they call it, they're basically vote centers. You can come from all over, anywhere in the county. Vote, and I think Washington State also has the same. Utah, I think they just recently went to all mail-in voting. Previously, they had a system where the counties select to have an all mail election ballot, and then they would still have to have a regular precinct ballot, but I think they just changed that.
But in all those states, it's a transition over many years to most people that using mail-in, that's when the precinct putting this sort of roll back. But I mean, I completely agree. I mean, voting centers, that's where really voting is not going to be on. If anything, there's all sorts of other precincts, sorts of issues that talk about. Whether it's like that, yeah, having a precinct for tender voters, when the range it is right now.
I know one thing to talk about election law advisory board is in that situation, there's nothing I don't believe in legislation stopping the commissioners or the election board from sort of lobbying those 10 registered voters to vote by mail. You can't force them to do that, but you can surely explain the situation. And as long as they all request a ballot before the deadline, you don't have to have a polling place.
That is true.
Because they've all already.
you know them well enough, you can probably pick out that one guy. Make the other 9 back.
So we don't open that polling place. And number 11, who never voted before, shows up and wants to vote.
Well, they have to be registered.
You say
Yes, it
yes.
Maybe take some, don't give it wrong.
You're not unique. There's the room snakes.
There's
There's 5 spots on the board here.
there's one dance. Some it's not what it's what's done. It was the kind
Because there are some staff and in an ideal world. Further share, they're easier to manage. Because it's just, I know, you've got what, 1,600?
So, like, anything, yeah, we look at West Consolidates.
Consolidate.
We actually did, it was the first time ever.
Yes.
Grove 2 and 3, we put in the same building because of COVID, there was only so many places that wanted to have you.
And have they stayed that way since?
No, they were permitted.
Yeah, they were allowed to.
They're not permitted.
That in Act 12, I think.
Yeah, we've got to do it done that, and they
Have permanently continued that with same building, 2 precincts.
We have that in Lawrence, yeah.
I want to say it's at the Scottish Rite Cathedral, but I don't know why now. But I have it in my head.
We had a few of that. But they've been doing it for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I.
Full disclosure about this little borough, it was created in the 1970s. It is a Slovenian resort / campground. And they were located in a dry township, and they obviously were serving alcohol. And they wanted to serve it ladies. So. The law has changed. Now you have to have at least 500 people in each borough. But back then, they created it so they could be a wet municipality, which they now are. You can legally drink in this borough.
My daughter-in-law used to go there for the pulpits. But anywhere, yeah.
That's- They have their own mayor, 3-member borough council. Well, it's,
building.
well, they've got a nice campground. Did he ever tell you about it?
And he just said, and he still gets the help.
Yeah.
Okay. Question. Lisa, you were talking about leaving at 3. Does anybody else have to leave? Well, that- A nice printed page, it's not on the agenda, so I'm not sure if I could even really do much with it anyway. But I was thinking that one of the things we do need to talk about, probably at our next fresh agenda meeting is ballot curing. Because that is something that we also need to look at with, when we're talking about dating ballots and signatures and everything else. We do have some ballot curing language in the statute, I believe. But I think we need to go a little further into that, and we don't have our research in front of us right now. So if we're gonna hang around for a half hour, just need to talk about it a little bit, what you think. But if everybody wants, needs, has had enough fun and is ready to go home, we're good with that too. I feel this was a really productive session. I think we got a lot for us to go back to our offices and start drafting some stuff on. We will have a meeting in some form this fall to approve the final version of whatever we've come up with out of this meeting. So that, as I said earlier, that I don't think we'll get anything that we won't get anything enacted before November. But the new administration coming in January, we should be able to have stuff for the General Assembly to look at and move forward if they so choose. So if everybody's okay with that, I say thank you. Thank you for being open and willing to speak. This is a very, very table, and everybody makes nice, which is nice for us. So Dan, Ken,
Yeah. We're good?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I think Ann has a comment and anyone else, but I just want to say this is great to see everyone in person. Thank you everyone who came on August Monday for this. I don't know that our next one needs to be in person if we're just going to be approving things, but I would like to make sure that we continue to make sure we continue to meet in person. But it's great to meet some of you in person for the first time and actually see people as full human beings, not just a. And I love the dialogue. Respectful, disagree, as I've said from the beginning, at some point, like us, that we have some tangible results, but we understand that that's up to the General Assembly. But thank everyone for the participation.
We can give it to them And they will do, we've had stuff that's taken 10 years to be enacted. But the advantage is you guys will be here in 10 years, so. I mean. That's. We don't spend any money.
They're almost saying, seems to say something.
Probably years.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
So I have to ask a question. Since Christina and I agree on this, vividly, it's gotta be a great idea, and I'm gonna go back to my R and D on the ballot. I think that might be able to be resolved at the Department of State.
Yeah, it's a short.
So I'm gonna press Jonathan when I talk to him, and I don't wanna be assumptive on that, but I'm thinking that's pretty easy to fix.
I think everybody agreed. I don't think anybody would object if you lobbied them to try to. That's fine.
It's not, it's a, they must get rid of that.
I mean, just, on record, they must.
Christina, this is how it's called.
Yeah.
Get it done.
Dan,
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the staff for your consideration in terms of having this in person. I find this format so much better than Zoom. And notwithstanding the fact, without a doubt, I think I've got the longest drive to get here, it's about 4.5 hours. But as often as we can meet in person, I hope we can. I understand your point about maybe next time.
I really only want like an hour of your time next time, so to drive everybody into Harrisburg for that would seem a little excessive, but I like having a window of 4 or 5 hours to work in, because then we really feel like we're making progress, and you can't do that on Zoom, at least I can't always. So.
And my thanks to all of you for that.
Mr. Chairman, technically, we have to have you make a motion, or have somebody offer a motion for adjournment.
yeah, I mean, I guess we had some comments.
Just a formality.
I move to adjourn. A second. All right. It's been moved in second. Does anyone dissent? There are none. We're done.
Yeah.